The night air was heavy with silence until a scream shattered it like glass. Detective James Carter said, "No one should ever see something like this." His flashlight beam caught crimson stains on a peeling wall, forming a cryptic word. The shadows seemed alive, pressing close, as if they too wanted to swallow the truth. "Officer Miller," whispered, "it looks fresh, James." James' jaw tightened as he stepped forward, his boots crunching over broken glass. He knew this was no ordinary crime scene. This was deliberate, personal, and cruel. The old motel reeked of mildew and despair. A window rattled in the storm outside, its rhythmic banging against the frame, an eerie metronome. James muttered, "Someone wanted to make sure we never forget this." The message on the wall glistened wet under the light, a signature of someone confident, taunting. His chest tightened with dread, but also with resolve. James thought of the years he spent chasing ghosts of unsolved cases. He whispered, "Not this time." James whispered, "This is no random act." The motel smelled of old rot, the kind that seeps into the walls. Miller said, "Who would do this here?" James scanned the scene, every detail screaming intentional. He noticed the blood didn't drip naturally, it had been arranged. The killer wanted to be seen. The pounding storm outside mirrored the chaos in James' head. His heart raced, not from fear, but from recognition. Something about this felt familiar. His mind reached back to old files, cold cases where evidence never fit but stayed with him like a splinter. Miller stepped closer, his voice shaking. "James, do you think this ties to your old case?" James tightened his grip on the flashlight, saying, "If it does, then we're in deeper trouble than you can imagine." The storm roared, lightning cracking across the window as if echoing his words. James knew this wasn't the beginning of a crime. This was the continuation of something unfinished. The motel room felt smaller with every breath. James muttered, "This message wasn't for the victim, it's for us." Miller's voice cracked, "Why would they taunt the police?" James' eyes didn't leave the wall. He felt the weight of someone watching, even though the room was empty. The walls groaned under the storm's force, dust drifting from the ceiling. James stepped closer, noticing faint scratches near the door, like someone had clawed their way out. Miller shivered, his hand brushing his holster. James said, "They're playing a game, and they want us to follow the rules." The storm cracked again, sending light across James' face. He felt the pull of the past. The cold case that haunted him had just come alive. James pressed his palm against the doorframe, feeling grooves carved deep. He whispered, "These marks, they're desperate, like someone fighting to escape." Miller's breath quickened as he replied, "Or fighting to stay alive." The air was thick, pressing against them, as though the motel itself held its breath. James remembered crime scene photos from years ago, victims leaving traces of last struggles, silent screams etched into the environment. His gut twisted. "This killer," James said, "wants me to see this, to relive it." Lightning flared, casting long shadows that made the scratches seem alive. Miller looked at him uneasily. "James, you look like you've seen this before." James exhaled, his voice hollow. "I have." The storm outside roared louder, shaking the walls as if the motel itself resisted revealing its secrets. James turned sharply, scanning the corners where shadows pooled. His instinct screamed, "Danger." Miller said, "We should call this in." James shook his head, "Not yet." He crouched again, spotting faint footprints smeared in the blood, leading deeper into the room. His pulse quickened. The killer had lingered here. James muttered. He waited, he watched, and then he left this for us. Miller's face paled, the reality sinking in. James' voice dropped low. "This isn't just a crime scene. It's an invitation." James sat at his desk, the storm still echoing in his mind. The motel case lingered like smoke he couldn't breathe out. Files were scattered, cold cases long forgotten by others. He whispered, "They never stop haunting me." His office smelled of stale coffee and ink. The lamp flickered, casting uneven light over faces in photographs. Miller leaned against the wall, arms crossed, voice low. You've been carrying this for years, James. James rubbed his temples, exhaustion etched in his movements. Every unsolved case is a scar, he muttered. The silence thickened, broken only by a creak from the old building. James looked at the photo of a missing girl, her smile frozen in time, and felt the weight of promises never kept. His chest tightened, but he held the picture steady. He whispered, "I won't fail again." The storm outside faded, but the storm inside him only grew sharper, cutting him from within. Morning light pushed its way into James' apartment, but it felt unwelcome. He sat by the window, a mug untouched in his hands. His reflection in the glass looked older, worn, like time had chipped away at him. He said quietly, "How many years have I wasted chasing shadows?" The city outside moved on, indifferent to his pain. His phone buzzed on the table, Miller's name flashing. James ignored it, lost in thought. He remembered promises to himself, to never let another case slip. The silence cut deep. He muttered, "Obsession or justice? Maybe both." His pulse throbbed in his temple, a reminder of nights without rest. He finally turned, staring at the files stacked like monuments to failure. He whispered, "I owe them the truth." The sunlight brightened, but for James the world still felt gray, stained by ghosts that refused to leave. The precinct bustled with noise, but James walked through it like a ghost. Officers chatted, phones rang, but his focus stayed locked on the board of cold cases. He stopped, eyes fixed on the motel crime, photos pinned beside old ones. Miller joined him, speaking softly, "You think it's connected?" James didn't look away. "I know it is," he said, voice steady but heavy. His hand traced across a pinned photo, a victim long forgotten. The scent of ink and sweat filled the air. He whispered, "I should have solved this years ago." Miller frowned, worry in his eyes. "You'll destroy yourself if you let it consume you." James exhaled slowly, eyes burning with determination. "Then let it consume me," he muttered. The noise of the precinct blurred, leaving only the weight of unresolved truth pressing against his chest. James found himself in the records room, the smell of dust and old paper thick in the air. Shelves towered around him, lined with forgotten files. He pulled one out, the faded ink smudged on the cover. His hand trembled slightly as he opened it. The photo inside made his breath hitch. It was the same kind of mark he'd seen on the motel wall, years apart, but identical. Miller entered quietly, voice soft, "You've carried this ghost too long." James looked up, his eyes dark. "This isn't just about the past, he's back." Miller hesitated, "And he wants you to know it." James slammed the file shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the room. His jaw clenched. "Then he'll get my attention." The weight of the file in his hand felt like both a curse and a weapon. That night, James sat alone in his car, parked outside the motel crime scene, now sealed with tape. The rain had returned, blurring the windshield. He didn't move, only stared at the yellow tape fluttering in the storm. He whispered, "You wanted me here. Well, I'm here." His chest rose and fell with sharp breaths, the tension clawing inside him. He remembered every victim's name, every unanswered question. The wipers squeaked across the glass, but his focus stayed locked on the shadowy outline of the building. Miller's words echoed in his mind, warnings about obsession. James gripped the steering wheel tighter, veins standing out on his hands. "This ends with me," he said firmly. The storm raged louder, thunder shaking the car, but James didn't flinch. He was ready to face whatever waited inside the darkness. The night swallowed the city, but James' mind was louder than the streets. He stood at the motel crime board in the precinct, staring at photos pinned like a puzzle. His fingers tapped the table, each beat restless. Miller entered, his voice hesitant. "You haven't slept, have you?" James didn't answer. His eyes burned as they locked on the strange symbol scrawled in blood. "This isn't random," he muttered. The board was cluttered with threads connecting old cases. Miller tried to sound confident, Maybe it's just a copycat. James turned sharply, his tone cold. No, this is the same hand. I'd stake everything on it. The silence grew heavy, broken only by the hum of the precinct lights. James whispered, "He's back, and he wants me to follow." His chest tightened as memory and present blurred into one haunting trail. James traced the bloody symbol on a photo, his finger pausing as if he could feel the killer's intent through the image. He muttered, "He's taunting me." Miller shifted uneasily, his voice low. "You think he knows you're on this?" James gave a bitter smile. He's always known. The precinct door creaked as the night air swept in, chilling the room. James grabbed a marker, circling connections furiously, his voice harsh. Every thread leads back to one thing: control. Miller stepped closer, his tone steady. "Then we take that control back." James stopped, his hand frozen mid-air, the tension clear. He whispered, "If we're not careful, he'll make us part of his game." The weight of truth pressed hard, drowning out every other sound in the bustling precinct beyond. The alley reeked of trash and damp concrete. James crouched low, flashlight cutting through the darkness. Miller stood guard, scanning nervously. James said he was here. The footprints don't lie. The prints were smeared in dried blood, leading toward a dumpster. Miller's voice was hushed. "Why bring us here?" James' jaw tightened. "Because he wants me to feel the chase." The storm clouds above cracked faint thunder, and the alley seemed to breathe unease. James ran his hand along the wall, stopping on a fresh scratch. He muttered, marking territory. Miller shivered, whispering, "Like he's watching us." James' flashlight beam trembled slightly, but his voice was steady. "He is." Every shadow felt alive, every corner ready to betray them. James pushed open the dumpster lid with his flashlight, the stench overwhelming. Inside was a torn piece of clothing, soaked in crimson. Miller gagged, covering his nose. James whispered, "He leaves pieces like breadcrumbs." Miller's voice shook. "That belonged to her, didn't it?" James clenched his teeth, eyes locked on the fabric. His heart pounded, memories flooding in, but his voice was flat. "Yes, he's mocking me." The sound of dripping water echoed through the alley, rhythmic and cruel. James reached inside with gloved hands, lifting the evidence carefully. His chest burned with rage and guilt. Miller muttered, "He's dragging you into the past." James whispered, "He never let me leave it." The air seemed colder, the night pressing against their skin like a warning. Back at the precinct, James slammed the evidence bag onto the table, his voice sharp. "He's playing me, Miller." The room fell silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Miller tried to reason, "We've got something solid now. We can move forward." James leaned over the table, eyes blazing. "Solid? This is bait." His fists clenched, knuckles white. The sound echoed in the sterile room, louder than words. Miller's voice softened. "You don't have to carry this alone." James met his gaze, the fire in his eyes dimming to exhaustion. "But I do," he whispered. His chest rose heavily, every breath weighed down by guilt. The photos and files surrounding him seemed to close in. The killer wasn't just out there. He was inside James' head, winning. The morgue was cold, the air thick with antiseptic and silence. James stood over the slab, eyes fixed on the victim's torn clothing, now cleaned and sealed. Miller said, "This piece matches one from the alley." James' hand trembled as he pointed at the stitching. "Not just a match, it's identical to the case 10 years ago." His chest constricted, his voice lower. "The killer never disappeared. He's been waiting." The sound of the fridge door closing echoed like a gunshot in the hollow space. Miller frowned, whispering, "You mean he planned all this?" James nodded grimly. "Planned it, and tied it directly to me." The revelation weighed heavier than the cold air. He had spent years chasing ghosts, but the ghost had always been alive, watching. James slammed the old file onto the table, papers scattering. His voice shook with fury. "They called it closed, but it never was." Miller tried to calm him. "You couldn't have known." James glared, his jaw tight. I should have known. The signs were there. He flipped through photos, each one a scar etched into memory. The victims stared back, frozen in time, their pain screaming through faded ink. Miller placed a hand on the table. Don't blame yourself for what he hid. James' chest heaved, rage boiling. This wasn't hidden. It was ignored. The fluorescent light above buzzed, shadows stretching across the file, the truth bleeding from every page. James whispered bitterly, he never stopped killing. We just stopped looking. The room was quiet, except for James' uneven breathing. He leaned back, gripping his temples, whispering, he's been one step ahead all this time. Miller leaned forward, cautious. But why resurface now? James stared at the board, eyes narrowing. Because I never left him behind. I was always his unfinished work. His words hung like a curse. Miller's face paled, realization dawning. He's targeting you. James's lips pressed thin. No, he's using me. He wants the chase alive again. The precinct's hum felt distant, like the world had shrunk to the truth between them. James whispered, this isn't just a killer. It's a message that I was never free. The silence cracked when the phone on James' desk rang, shrill and jarring. He froze, Miller's eyes snapping toward it. James answered slowly, his voice steady, Carter. A distorted voice hissed, low and taunting. Still chasing me, detective? James' grip tightened, every muscle locking. Who are you? He demanded. The caller chuckled, chilling and cruel. You already know. Miller mouthed, trace it. James' knuckles whitened, his voice fierce. Why now? The voice lingered like smoke. Because the game isn't over. It never was. The line went dead, leaving silence heavier than before. James' breath shuddered as he whispered. He called me. James dropped the receiver, his chest pounding. Miller whispered. That was him, wasn't it? James' eyes were locked on nothing, his voice distant. He wanted me to hear him, to feel him alive again. The precinct air felt suffocating, every sound muted. James turned to the board, the photos now glaring back like an accusation. He muttered, he's pulling me into his design. Miller grabbed his arm, firm. Then we pulled back. James shook him off, voice raw. No, if he wants me in, I'm already there. The truth had shifted. This wasn't just investigation. It was personal resurrection of a nightmare. James whispered, the past never died. It waited for me. Midnight draped the freight yard in oily darkness, and the rails hummed like a warning. James said, he wanted us here. Miller scanned the rows of boxcars, nerves tight as wire. Wind whipped grit across the gravel, stinging their eyes. A horn moaned in the distance, low and mournful. James lifted his light and traced fresh boot prints cutting between cars. Miller said, backup is 5 out. James shook his head. He won't wait. A burner phone sat on a crate, blinking. James answered, voice hard. Victor said, you still follow my breadcrumbs. James replied, I'm here for the last one. Laughter hissed through static, thin and cruel. Victor said, then find the carriage with the open door. The line died, leaving their breaths loud and human. James whispered, he's close, and stepped into the maze of iron and shadow. They moved between hulking cars, steps careful, hearts louder than the wind. James said, watch the gaps. A door groaned ahead, half open like a mouth. Miller whispered, he's baiting us. James swept the beam across a dangling scrap of cloth, stained and deliberate. He felt the prison of memory closing, but he kept moving. A phone chimed again from inside the car. Victor said, tell me, detective, do you still believe in endings? James answered, only in arrests. A chain clattered above, and a shadow slipped along the catwalk. Miller raised his light, breath sharp. James said, split wide, cover the ladder. The air smelled of old fuel and rain. The catwalk creaked, and the chase snapped to life like a match in the dark. They climbed to the catwalk, boots ringing on steel. A recorder blinked red beside a coil of rope. Victor's voice spilled out, smooth and venomous. "You never left me, James." James said, "Step into the light." Silence answered, heavy as iron. Miller scanned the roofline, whispering, "South corner, movement." James moved low, breath measured. The recorder clicked again. Victor said, "Trade a truth for a truth." James replied, "You took theirs. Give me yours." Wind tore at their coats, and rain needled their faces. A flare blossomed on a distant roof, painting the yard in bloodlight. James said, "He wants angles on us." Miller muttered, "He has them." The catwalk shivered as someone ran 3 cars away, fast and sure. A figure broke from shadow on the roof and sprinted for a ladder. James shouted, "Stop!" The runner paused, turned, and the face matched a file that never let him sleep. Victor said, still a step behind. James advanced, gun low, voice steady. "It ends here." Victor smiled like a thin cut. "You brought echoes, not answers." Miller flanked right, radio crackling in his fist. James said, "Hands where I can see them." Victor stepped back and clipped a line to the ladder cage. He said, "Catch me, or save them." A timer beeped from below, fast and cruel. Miller cursed, "Device undercar." James' pulse hammered. He said, "I'm not choosing tonight." Then he ran toward the ladder, and the beeping heart beneath the steel. James hit the gravel beside the undercar, and found the device taped near the axle. He said, "Foil wrap, crude trigger, radio cue." Miller covered the ladder, shouting, "He's moving." James cut the line and pried the timer, breath ragged. The numbers bled seconds like a wound. Victor called from above, "Choose, detective." James growled, "I choose neither," and yanked the battery clean. The beeping died, leaving only rain and rails. Miller said, "He's cutting free." James rose, sprinting back, legs hot with fire. He reached the ladder as Victor swung to the next car, and vanished behind steam. Sirens wailed at the yard gate, slicing the night. James said, "We live another minute. He lives another mile." The victory tasted like rust, sharp and unfinished. The freight yard was silent now, emptied of chaos, but filled with echoes. James sat in the back of the squad car, drenched, his trench coat heavy with rain. Miller leaned against the door, breathing hard. James said, "We stopped the device, but not him." His words cracked like glass, exhaustion bleeding through. The sirens faded into distance, leaving only dripping steel and a bitter taste of failure. Miller muttered, "You saved lives tonight." James's gaze stayed fixed on the dark tracks stretching away. "He let me," he whispered. The truth carved into him deeper than wounds. The killer was alive, free, laughing somewhere beyond the fences. James clenched his fists, whispering, "This isn't victory. It's survival." The precinct briefing room buzzed with restless energy, but James sat apart, eyes hollow. Photos of the bomb and Victor's silhouette lit the projector screen. The captain barked orders, but James only heard his own pulse pounding. Miller whispered, "They're listening to you." James muttered, "They only hear what they want." He pushed a folder forward, pointing at patterns others ignored. His voice sharpened, "He's not just fleeing, he's guiding." Murmurs rippled across the room, but James didn't care. He whispered, "He'll come again. Not when we're ready, when he decides." The room grew tense, the truth weighing heavier than the fluorescent light. That night, James returned to his apartment. The city glowed indifferent beyond his window. He set his gun on the table and dropped the file beside it. His hand lingered on a photo of the first victim, her smile haunting. He whispered, "I should have protected you." The silence pressed in, broken only by the hum of his fridge. His reflection in the glass looked older, carved by years of regret. Miller called on his phone, but James ignored it, unable to bear hope. He muttered, "This isn't closure, it's a pause." He poured a glass of whiskey, but his hand trembled before it reached his lips. He whispered again, "Not closure, not yet." James walked the old cemetery path, the earth soft under steady drizzle. He stood before a weathered stone, tracing the engraved name of the first victim. He whispered, "I failed you then, but I won't again." The rain masked the sting in his eyes. Miller approached slowly, umbrella in hand, his voice careful. "You're not alone, James." James shook his head, his hand still pressed to the stone. "I was the one he wanted from the start." Miller's silence held weight, unspoken truths heavy between them. The rain fell harder, the world shrinking to two men and a grave. James whispered, "This fight doesn't end until one of us is gone." Back at his desk, James pinned the latest evidence beside the old files. The board stretched wider now, scars of the past fused with the present. He stood alone, shoulders rigid, determination set in his jaw. He whispered, "You want me in your game? Fine." Miller entered quietly, placing a fresh coffee on the table. James didn't look away from the board. His voice carried steel. "This ends when I bring him down. Not before." Miller nodded silently, the bond between them unspoken but unbreakable. The clock ticked slow, a reminder of time bleeding away. James whispered one last vow. "I'll finish this." The city streets glistened with rain, neon bleeding into puddles. James walked slowly, coat collar up, his breath fogging the night air. He whispered, "Every step I take, he's already ahead." Miller followed close, voice steady. "We'll find him, James." But James' eyes were elsewhere, fixed on shadows that moved like ghosts. He muttered, "This doesn't end with an arrest. It ends when he decides it does." The night pressed in, heavy with silence and expectation, as though the city itself held its breath. James stopped at the alley where it all began, the walls still scarred by rain and graffiti. He touched the bricks, whispering, "I chased you here once, and I'll chase you again." Miller said softly, "The case isn't cold anymore. It's burning." James nodded, but his jaw tightened. "The fire won't stop until one of us is ash." A distant sound echoed, a clanging pipe, or maybe footsteps. Both men turned sharply, hands on their holsters, the night alive with menace. A phone buzzed in James' pocket, screen glowing unknown. He answered, silence pressing against his ear. Then Victor's voice slid through, low and mocking. "You never stop following me, James." James' throat tightened. "This ends tonight." Victor chuckled, "Tonight, it only begins again." The line cut, leaving static ringing in James' ears. He whispered, "He's everywhere, he's nowhere." Miller's face hardened, but his voice carried strength. "Then we hunt him in the shadows until he slips." James nodded faintly, the vow sinking deep into his bones. They stood on the rooftop overlooking the city, lights stretching endless below. James whispered, "He's not just a man anymore. He's a ghost I'll chase until I stop breathing." Miller said firmly, "Then we chase him together." The wind howled, carrying the faint sirens of a restless city. James' eyes burned as he whispered, "He wanted me broken, but I'm still standing." The skyline seemed infinite, but James felt the walls of the chase closing tighter, every light below another reminder of lives that depended on him. James returned to the precinct, standing before the board one last time. Photos stared back, threads connecting across years of torment. His hand brushed the latest picture, his voice low. "I'll never stop." Miller placed a hand on his shoulder, steady but silent. The clock ticked loud, every second a warning that Victor was still out there. James whispered, "This case doesn't close. It waits." He turned away, the board glowing like an altar behind him. The truth was simple, final, and haunting. The chase had no ending, only echoes.